Hello, good afternoon. It's July 6th, and sorry to say, but Mexico lost yesterday. And today is Canada against, I forget who they're against. Anyway, that's later on this evening. Again, to my audience, I'll say hello to Darcy. Also, I've noticed there's been a spike in people who are listening to my podcast. So thank you for being out there and being curious about what I have to say and the stories I have to talk about. About half an hour ago, I had a friend. He's a plumber. I call him. I needed help to do some things because there are some. I have limitations in mobility as well as help, just going from point A to point B. And I rarely call him, but it was good that I called him. And we had a conversation. Again, I enjoy the conversations I have with different people. And this particular fellow is a brother to my nephew. And they go fishing almost every weekend. So he was saying, I saw you on TV. And I said, which TV? What program? So I had told him it was all about my being in the courtroom to witness Nathan Chasinghorse being sentenced. And so he's been a long time acquaintance that I've touched base with once in a while, and we managed to talk. And I said to him, things are pretty tight financially right now. I said, because, the past, I had to pay my way down to Las Vegas twice. And so the things that I wanted to do for the summer was like my garden, my flowers, like all that I had to put on hold. And then the limitations that I found myself into and the reality, like, okay, my whole life I've just struggled on my own. I've never had a partner who helps pay the rent or helps pay my bills, or like, I'm sounding really pitiful, but really I'm not, I swear. And this acquaintance, his name's Kevin. He has two daughters, extremely intelligent. Like, one's getting her PhD in chemistry, I think, in November. And like, they're just like so dynamic, these young girls, these young women. And so I'm always super impressed when he's so proud of his daughters. And the reality of it is, like, when you look at his daughters, you don't know that they're Indigenous because they're white passing. And like, I have a first cousin who's white passing. He's got blonde hair and blue eyes. And my great-grandmother was white passing as well. She had blue eyes. And she spoke fluent Dakota. And like, we're talking like over 100 years ago here, okay? My great-grandmother in the late 1800s. So amongst the Sioux people, we've been intermarrying, switching bloodlines for a long time. So even the reality of like 500 years ago. And this is what's really astonishing when it comes to immigrants or people who come into Canada or just like from Africa or Europe or some part of this planet, and they come into this new world. But this is 500 years. This isn't like with the Greeks or the Egyptians, like this is new world stuff. And a lot of people go, oh, well, it's new world. Yeah, well, you're classifying it as new world because that's what you feel comfortable with. The reality is, like, we've been here thousands of years, 30, 20, 10,000. And, the proof is in the pudding now when you look at science. And a lot of people don't want to look at science, or they just are so busy on day-to-day living, like going to jobs, sleeping, waking up, listening to the masses. And that's the reality of life. All you have to do is give somebody permission to do something, and they'll do it. Perfect example is the Calgary Stampede. Just tell somebody, here, have a drink. Let's go out and party. Give them permission, and they'll go and do it. We have the largest divorce rate the largest family breakups during the 10 days of the Calgary Stampede, as well as, like when I was a child, we had thousands of men who worked in the oil fields up north or even down south come into Calgary. The human trafficking that went on and still goes on is barbaric. So I rarely go to the Stampede, but I regress because, again, all that reminds me of is, people from another race trying to seduce me, even as a 12-year-old child, catcalling me, trying to get me, or even taking pictures of me at 12 years old, like, look at the pretty little Indian girl. Well, I don't think it was pretty little Indian girl. I think they were just curious in documenting a tame savage by the TP and the Calgary Stampede. Human zoo. And if people want to argue that, go ahead. Go ahead. Jeez. I've grown up with white people my entire life. And when I had a friend of mine, she's Japanese American. She only calls me when she's bragging, and she just got off a cruise ship. And she's married to a Lakota man. The irony of it is, like, she doesn't realize the only time she calls me is to say she's traveled, and yet she will not come to visit me. She will not pay a trip to come and visit me. So, like, hello, I'm trying to say to her, I'm not like your husband. I wasn't raised on an isolated reservation in the United States or any place, like in Canada, any place. I have lived on my reserve, RESERVE. Get that in Canada. Don't try to be hoity-toity and uppity and say reservation. Oh, come with that. Big capital F there. That's being uppity if you're saying that instead of reserve. And she's like that. Like, of course she's gotten under my skin because the reality is like, Marina, I do this and I'm doing that. I'm going, oh, that's good. That's fine. Like, she knows I just can't stand, even thinking of going on a cruise. I have visions of Jaws and the Titanic and tidal waves, tsunamis. Like, it just, and plus that I've watched YouTube videos on cruise ships and the cafeterias, and it's contained in it's like being imprisoned in a container, floating in a bottle on the water. I just can't stand it. Anyway, the point is that I tried to get across to her because I took her on a little joyride to the Costco, and I said to her, yeah, this is Sutina. I've tried to say to people, I've grown up in a town or a city. Like, even the fact when I talk to immigrants and I say, I'm 74 years old and I used to go all the way down to the Olympic Plaza, what used to be the Olympic Plaza or City Hall, and that old building that's still the remnants of the old City Hall. That's where there used to be a Safeway, and that's where everybody used to go and get their groceries. Even the Italians in the northeast side of the city, like in the older section in the north part up Center Street. And then, of course, there's Chinatown right by the bridge there. So there are certain places in Calgary that, were established when I was a child. But at the same time, too, the immense influx of population and immigrants. And even as a child, I was hoping there were more people of color coming into the city. Because when my parents traveled to South America and India, I was like 8 and 10. And so I heard stories of like the thousands of people, thousands of Indigenous people in the Americas and thousands of people in India. Like, I just knew there were more dark-skinned people than there were white. So I also knew systemic racism in the sense of how poor and destitute, like, just depending on big corporations coming into these third world countries, like the whole genre of it. And that's been like, we'll give it a good 50 years here. So life changes so fast. And even though everybody right now is just humming and hawing over the United States president and how sad of a human being he is because he doesn't even know. Like, I was talking to my friend, I said, I know how to bareback. I know how to get on a horse bareback. I know how to rope a horse. I know how to, get on the horse. there's certain, I can go and snare rabbits. I can live off the land. Uh, I don't see, like, when this man, this or I don't even know if I want to call him a man. Are you like, I'm sorry, but he is just a sad human being. He is so sad that everything he does seems to, he says, everything I touch turns to gold, but when you really look at it, like, it's fool's gold. And the fact that he bought his way into leadership. Now, why am I harping on this? Is because that's nothing. That's a poo-poo. He's a drop in the bucket. 8 years, and making what? Like, I'm pretty sure there are a hell of a lot of American citizens who have done exceptional jobs and are great human beings. But to have somebody represent and say, this is the best of the best that you've got, that's a tragedy. It's so sad. But the reality of it is, like, you look at the situation here. When I say 100 years ago, when they just saw so many people dying, even the secrets that U.S. presidents kept in knowing what's in the Amazon basin, and all the pyramids that were in the Americas that they hid, that they, all the things they kept secret that are coming out, and it's coming out in genetics. So understand this: the first 100 years they killed 5 generations of children. Now, I want you to take a look at this. Like, when you look at World War II and 6 million Jews, that's nothing. That is nothing compared to 100 years. Divide 100 years into 6, or whatever. How many millions are killed every year for the first 100 years. Now, when people saw all this happening, all these people coming into the Americas, and they wanted to create profit. Like genetically, even if you look at, like, the cultivation, the horticulture of tomato, or even any of the plants that are vegetables that are edible now, comes from thousands of years of cross-pollinating, cultivating through indigenous ways of knowing. In the Amazon, in Central America, in the North America, there was so much trading. There was so much civilization. I say civilization because we were not as destructive as the old world, like the Romans and the Greeks. The barbarianism of. Anyway, you all know more about your history than you do know about the indigenous histories of the Americas, because they oppressed it and suppressed it. And so when you do higher education and you realize, okay, what was the solution to create economy and make the Americas what they are today? Well, they imported black people. And of course, 500 years ago, they knew of the, I don't want to use the word resilience because it's overused, but I'll say DNA diversity of black people. I mean, like it's from one Nigeria or Ghana or some, like, just within, and the country, the continent itself is so huge, but the diversity of people, like the smartest to the dumbest, to the tallest, to the shortest, to the fattest, to the skinniest, to the, you name it, the diversity in Africa is so abundant. And obviously, 500 years ago, it's a drop in the bucket in terms of evolution. And that they had to have seen how strong black people in Africa were. And because they'd been around the old world diseases that were plaguing Europe at the time. So, of course, they brought in black people to work as slaves. They tried that with the Native Americans, the indigenous people, and the indigenous people were dying by the millions. I mean, imagine how many, the civilization they wiped out in the Amazon basin, and the thousands of pyramids and the thousands of indigenous people that made the Americas great. See, this greatness that this white man who doesn't even know how to ride a horse, probably couldn't even know how to survive on the land if he was 5 or 10 years old. Like, come on, give me, when you live off the land and you know how to survive, and you know that as a human being, you know what you're capable of. But when you just try to manipulate and control and say you can do things and you can't live up to it, and you have to blame people for all your shortcomings, you can't do that when you're living off the land. So of course, that's basically patriarchy in a nutshell. I'm not saying all patriarchs are bad. I'm just saying that in order to establish plantations and in order to have control over another human being, you had to have slaves. And the reality of it is that because of how the lifestyles of the old world, that black people were able to combat and live to survive against all the plagues of Europe, but that they brought them to the Americas and killed off 5 generations of children, not just through diseases. There were horrific ways of torture and killing, dismembering. If they didn't want to be slaves, they cut off their hands and just torture. Like they said, I think the Portuguese, Dutch, Spaniards, English, and French. And out of all of them, I think the French were the least ones barbaric. I think the Dutch was worse, or the Portuguese, and then the Spaniards. So yes, there was a lot of killing going on, but at the same time, the transition in terms of how far we were in terms of genetic drift is amazing, because today, we live it. We as Indigenous people, we have all these things that we understand, and how we have to maintain our own health. Even how our nervous system is set up, even our pain thresholds are different. So I've discussed that to some part in my podcast, but I just wanted to say too, there, especially about a prophecy that a lot of non-Indigenous people who may feel like, oh my goodness, I'm so sad that our history did all this, and how can we make it up to you? Well, please don't mansplain us. Don't come into our ceremonies as if you know what the hell you're doing, and explain it to us how to give away, how to do certain things, when you yourself have just, shacked up with one of our men or one of our women, and, think that now that you've come in halfway through the conversation that you know what the hell you're doing, when you obviously don't. So I think that's the same thing with immigration. You've come into the Americas half knowing what it is that you're coming into. And a lot of times, systemic racism, especially when it comes to nonprofit organizations fighting amongst each other for the same dollar, like that really divides and conquers people of color, minorities. So the whole process of truth and reconciliation and the TRC and the calls for action is the basic rudimentary groundwork of like, we'll use horticulture, like in planting. You're preparing the soil, because there are roots, and then there's the stem and the tree and the leaves that have to be nurtured. So all this comes in how you do urban planning, community development, infrastructure. Having those places having things in place for the people who move in, or for the people who are thriving and want to remain and contain their language and their culture, is vital. So when we use the concept of truth and reconciliation, or the TRC, and how it applies to Indigenous people in Canada and the Americas, it is a ground framework for all people, immigrants who come into the country. Rather than having, a white person say to you, a Japanese person saying to you, you can't wear your kimono, you can't learn Japanese, you got to learn English, you got to dress this way. Like, that's not too far away. So all these things that Indigenous people have been struggling for and trying to gain voice to and educate people about our Indigenous ways of knowing is to help cross that we'll say dimensional bridge, because in some ways you have to really shift the way you think, and a lot of times too, even for Indigenous people who don't have that connection, who may not have the higher education or have feel some low self-esteem because you're not around academics or you don't see doctors, lawyers. They're out there. Indigenous people or millionaires, they're out there. Or when you have people who, say, for example, the Tsuut'ina Tribal Police put up a sting operation. The narrative was there was a 15-year-old on the internet, making herself known that she was open to date. And again, we're talking about human trafficking here. So the website had 5,000 hits within 24 hours, and they did charge 10 of the men. Now, I don't know if I think they put it on the newspapers, the pictures of the men that they arrested, and they're all immigrants. These are all men of color who came into Alberta wanting to get serviced by an Indigenous child. Human trafficking, like again, I try to explain to immigrants, Indigenous people don't even have sovereignty over our own children. Our programs are run by the province, and if you have a person who's working in child and family, they're not working under the chief and council. They're working under provincial guidelines and policies. So how does that even make the chief and council even have sovereignty over their own children? So I use the example, like if a woman has 5 kids, and I'm using this as an example. I'm not saying her name. She did live, she did exist, but she died. And her children were apprehended, put in foster care. Like you got to understand the ramifications of how the Indian Act created so much diversion, not only within Indigenous communities, but also with white people. And so even if we do have some sort of provincial guidelines to try and foster our children within relatives, even the relatives who abuse their own nieces and nephews and own relatives because the parent has died or something, it's still not a safe system. Because we don't have sovereignty over our child and family. So even the tribe an hour east of here, 14,000 of their children in foster care. Now, there are, I think, about 40,000 Indigenous people in the city of Calgary. How many of them are actually fostering Indigenous children? The majority of those children are put in different foster homes, mostly Vietnamese, Filipino, East Indian. Like these Indigenous children are put into white homes as well. And so you have a lot of immigrants thinking that, oh, what's the matter with Indigenous people? What's the matter with Indigenous women? They cannot look after their children. It's the way it is set up. Systemic racism. And so when you start looking at the different programs in let's say the Truth and Reconciliation in terms of certain inherent rights, trying to understand that some of those rights have to be constantly worked on. So, say for example, I was talking with an East Indian fellow, lived, I forget, 20 years in England. He says, when I go into a hospital, I could be sitting in that emergency room and having a heart attack, and they won't even look at me. I said, yes, because you're brown skin. I said, even for me, like just going in, I took care of my mother for probably 10 years or more. Every time she went into the emergency or an ambulance came, I went with her. Stayed by her side, even if it was in the ER for 10 hours. If she got admitted, she got admitted. When she was admitted, I'd go to visit her from the time 9 in the morning until 9 at night. 12 hours every day I would sit with her. She was so afraid of white people. so fawning over white people. Even though she was in pain, she'd think the doctors didn't want her to say, she'd just say, like if her pain threshold was 10, she'd think, oh, I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I'll just say it's 3. So there were a lot of things that I had to advocate for my mother because, again, of the conditioning she had in those Indian residential schools. And I'm pretty sure a lot of immigrants, especially women who have husbands who are misogynists, who tell their wives they can't say anything, they have to listen to them. There's advocacy for women in the hospitals, in shelters. So when I say, as Indigenous people, when we try to practice truth and reconciliation, and we're taking our mental health framework and we're trying to apply it to immigrants as well, because it works. The only thing is that if people aren't acting on it, if the government's not acting on it, then who is suppressed? That means the gap between immigrants and Indigenous people gets greater, and the racism gets worse. So, again, without even knowing the history of the construct or the narrative of the academics, the politicians, you like I said, all you have to do is give a human being permission to do something and they'll do it. Like giving permission for them to separate from Canada. They'll act on it. I mean, you can go right down to the nitty-gritty of casinos and alcohol and drug abuse. Like, we are so vulnerable as human beings. Now, why do I do my podcast? Well, again, I'm an advocate. I've talked, people will look and say, well, gee, growing up in my community, there have been silos created around me. I know that. It's lateral violence. So when immigrants come in and they talk about lateral violence, I understand it. I've lived it. But I think they don't realize, I think because they've come into a country from another country, that lateral violence is left in their country because maybe there was civil unrest. But it comes, it still percolates within the system here. Like you can. My late mother used to say this about my late father. When they went into South America and they'd ask him to talk, and she'd tell me, she said, he'd get up and he'd really have a good story, and people used to love listening to him. She says, but when it came down to it, and when it came right to our home and the way he treated me and like the children, she says, he never changed. And again, too, the trauma that both my parents experienced in Indian residential school, I can't even comprehend. I can give analogies and estimates to people who are working in community in terms of holistic way of approaching things. But even then, it's so abstract, and you have to have some basic understanding of psychology or even social structure to even comprehend it, because sometimes when you think you know, and you think you have it, then you exploit the person. I mean, we see that with the President of the United States. He's been able to bamboozle so many people because he only knows half of the story. But that half of that story sure, created a following, because it's too much, too hard to think. It's too hard to find balance. That's the whole thing about what makes life worth living. Everything. But it's the understanding of how to find balance. So I don't know. When I was talking to Kevin like a half an hour ago, I said, I was trying to see if I could somehow get reimbursed for the money that I spent. I said, but they won't help me. And he says, well, of course, Marina, they won't. He says, I know how they've treated you. And again, people who've known me my whole life know that in my community. And see, right now, even my saying this, okay, there are going to be people in my community who are going to say, oh, no. Or they're going to make some sort of excuse about me as an individual because they know me. And again, that's lateral violence. I know the things I've had to live in this community with or without. I've known the struggles I've had to work with my mother, who wasn't getting any help at all. You know, she needed the help, and I took care of her for over a decade. When people were getting paid $5,000 a month to look after their parent, or getting paid $1,000 a week to look after one of their relatives, I received nothing. And I knew because my mother had married in, and she was a Dakota woman. I knew that, and because of how my father had died, I think, let's see, maybe 49 years ago. You know, I knew the misogyny. You know, they just don't guarantee helping you, even if you're a widow, unless, you know, you attached yourself to some man. And even the women who marry in think less of you because, my goodness, you know, what's the matter with you? You haven't married a man. Or for even that matter, like when my uncle, he's got a great grandson. His great grandson is 17 years old, and my uncle passed away last year. He's only a few years older than me, and when we talked to my cousin, I said, "Yeah, Uncle only had has great grandchildren." She said, "Oh, that's so sad. He only had one son." I said, "No." I said, "I have no children. Are you saying I'm sad?" I said, "You know, having children isn't the be-all and end-all of living." And like with Kevin, his daughters have chosen not to have children. It's the same thing with my niece and nephew. Not all human beings are going to have children or families with children. That's the reality of this world. And more power to people who do choose to have children, because I really believe the social construct and the community that you raise your child in needs to have that structure from the time they're born until the time they die. And having that kind of society in this day and age is very rare. So that's why when it comes to Indigenous ways of knowing, it's our inherent right as Indigenous people who are born on this land to give birth on this land, live on the land that we were raised and born with until the day we die. We have no concept of ownership of land, none of that. The mortgages, nothing like that. So the whole construct of what white people or immigrants or people who live in those cities believe Indigenous people are living, you got to take that out of your mind. That's not how things operate in Indigenous communities. That means First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So that's why when I challenge or I struggle and I say, yes, you have a status card, but you could be pretending to be Indigenous because you've never lived in an Indigenous community. You've never lived in an Inuit, Métis, or First Nations community. Now, understand this too. If you're practicing, like if you have the connection, say from your father or your grandmother to that status card, and you do engage with your relatives, like your cousins and your aunties and all that, and for some reason you cannot have a house in your community, it's First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, the fact is that you're still actively keep a connection. You physically have relationships with your relatives that live on those Indigenous communities. So for me, when you have people who have the status card who are advocating the inherent rights of Indigenous people, who are educating people on the Truth and Reconciliation framework, it's the framework that helps establish anti-racism, not just for Indigenous people, but for Black people, for people of color. It's a basic framework, and my community has been using that framework and has been succeeding in human and economic development and will continue to succeed. So, you can get all the professors and all the scholars to study Maslow's theory of hierarchy, the Constitution of the United States, how it was created from the Mohawk Confederacy. You can do all that. You can do everything. But unless you are right there at the beginning and right there to the end, the whole understanding, the whole construct of a different way of thinking is so foreign. So that's my struggle. It's been my struggle since I started going to school in the white system. And again, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a social worker. I consider myself an artist. So again, because again, being an activist and telling people, oh, something's happening, there's poo-poo out there, or somebody's spending our band funds on stuff they shouldn't be spending it on. And you say, oh, you're just jealous, you're just poo-poo. And I'm going, oh, please, I'm working, I'm volunteering. Have I ever asked you for money? No. And even if I asked you for money, do you give it to me? No, because I don't know certain people in positions of power that are going to coddle me and brown nose me. And I had the opportunity when I was director of education, like I said, but I chose not to. And even now, like I said, when I came back after the sentencing and the money that I spent, and just the basic gossip of people want to know what the hell I was doing down there, or who, what, where, when, and how. Excuse me, I'm doing my podcast. If you bear to listen, you'll find out. But see, people don't want to realize that I have boundaries. I had one lady says, oh, I'm going to call you. I said, okay, go ahead. No, doesn't call. People wave at me. Yeah, I'm here. Really. I have a friend coming in from Montreal. Well, she came in from Montreal yesterday, and we're gonna spend some time together tomorrow. And I've known her since the pandemic. She says, Marina, if you ghosted me or you stop calling me, I'll call you and say, what did I do wrong? And I said to her, exactly. I said, exactly. So, the proof is in the pudding. I keep my boundaries. Yes, it's lonely and I'm alone. And yes, in the philosophical, spiritual, soul type felt motion type of reality is like, is anybody actually really ever alone? The whole difference of how people get along with each other's in families, the dynamics, the structure and how people gravitate to certain people and how we adopt mothers and fathers who aren't really our mothers and fathers, or our brothers and sisters who aren't really our brothers and sisters. The whole dynamics of just creating support is vital to the very existence. So, I don't know, I just find it such a interesting dynamics of people in academics and just working, and the realization that the things they put on TikTok gets people to sort of scratch their heads and going, I need to learn more about this. So the fact too that in terms of the horrors of what they did to black women in those slave plantations, or what they did to Indigenous children in those Indian residential schools. People don't want to realize that how savages humanity is. Just understand this. Like I said, people can see children dying in hospitals, but imagine, people didn't give a shit about, like, the first 100 years, 130 million children. And then people say, oh, look at what's happening in Gaza. Look what's happening in like the Jews, or the World War I and World War II. Or look what's happening in the plague. And like today around the world, a lot of people, live every day trying to pay their rent and mortgage, totally oblivious, like that what they're doing here affects somebody on the other side of the world. That's our reality. Again, yesterday I made an analogy of like all the atomic bombs and how, you just explode maybe 6 in one area, like say in Europe. I'm using Europe as an example, sorry. That's like an asteroid hitting in Europe. Well, why not? An asteroid hit an asteroid hit here in the Americas, between North and South America. An asteroid hit, separated humanity for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And the structure and the rituals and ceremonies that were created. Like I want you to get across in your mind here. Europeans have their religion, okay? But understand some of these prophecies that tried to be erased in the Americas. Like, you just have to think like, oh my goodness, the Creator is all powerful. Because, like I said, white buffalo calf woman came thousands of years ago predicting a white animal was going to appear. And when that white animal appeared, that there was going to be really tough times that could wipe us off the face of the earth. And so everybody thinks, oh, it's the atomic bombs and what's happening now, and even like this one human being called Trump. Like, Jello, he's just Jello. The reality is, like, come on, people. You got to look at the whole reality of Creator. The fact that 500 years ago, this white animal came into the Americas. For 500 years now, the Indigenous people have been fulfilling and living this prophecy. And you look at the game of soccer, and you see all the Indigenous people in Mexico and in South America, like in the Caribbeans. You look at all the Indigenous people in in United States and in Canada. It's just so profound. It's just so profound because people wanted to erase the history, but yet how can you do it? I'm 74. My name is Hapa. That's who I was born into. The colonial, or the what they call my teacher eloquently put it when I was in grade 5. My Christian name is Marina. So this whole Christian ideology has only been new in the whole scheme of the timeline. And as if there was an atomic bomb, 6 or 7 of them exploding, it would shift like an asteroid hitting the Earth. And again, what civilizations are they going to hide? The 5 conquering races covered so much in the Americas, but they couldn't hide the bloodline. The Ashatishakoe have O-type blood, universal blood donors. That's based on matriarchy. That's based on the ceremonies and rituals of white buffalo calf woman. See, just people think that white buffalo calf woman just came, what? So when Christianity came? No, that's something that Nathan Chasinghorse bastardized, and a lot of people fed into it. So excuse me if I'm very fucking critical, but that asshole did what he did and exploited so many Indigenous people, especially girls, especially communities who were hungry to find some sort of cultural value in what was left here in the Americas, what systemic racism tried to erase. Of course I'm going to do my podcast. Of course I'm going to alert people. The things that we do and we carry in our DNA and how we understand life is important. For all people have this gift. But for some reason, when somebody wants to control it or manipulate and bastardize the whole thing, people follow. So, I know it's not an easy thing to comprehend. I know sometimes it will take years. It's like a marriage. If you're in an abusive relationship and you don't realize that man just loves hitting you, just gets erections every time he hits you, like that's really perverse. and you're in danger because he could kill you. The most dangerous human being a woman can be around is their husbands. And again, excuse me, but the most dangerous men are white men, because they've been given permission to do things and they've gotten away with it. So, if you're a man and you're a man of color, it's hard. Because again, you have people of privilege who've gotten away with things and who've been allowed to get away with things. And the reality of it is like, what do they have to give? I always think of it as, like I said, with Jello, like it's wobbly. Yes, it has some form, but when you shake it, it jiggles. Like that's how flimsy it is. That for me, it's important for women to empower each other. It's important for women to understand just how genetically, like we're the first human being. Without women, there's no life. So, trying to oppress and suppress and call people or women different things like witches, which is totally a European construct. Medicine man, all that's a European construct. So things and how we perceive ourselves as human beings and how we treat each other is a constant reminder. And we have to have the courage to hold space. Because, sometimes people say, oh, well, I was kicked out of this country because of all the people they murdered. And then when I talk about the largest mass execution of the Sioux people, how they took all the land out of all the people out of Minnesota, the history, the thousands of years the Dakota people have been living in the waters in the Dakotas, that genetically our arm spans are different. Even like just how we lived, we weren't horse people. We were canoe people. The Lakota were horse people, and the Nakota. So, the Seven Council Fires and how we connected and married within the Seven Council Fires produced a rare blood type, and that's through ritual and ceremony, handed down by white buffalo calf women thousands and thousands of years before the white man came. And they were predicting that the white man was going to come. Now they took away all that for the past 500 years, and now through science, through oral history, through genetics, through the things we experience in ceremony and ritual, the reading of that energy that has been handed down by Creator and the grandfathers and grandmothers, that's Creator's will, the grandfathers and grandmothers, Creator, grandfathers and grandmothers' will being done. That's very strong, very powerful. That's the earth. That's the earth saying it. Not a piece of Jello wobbling on the face of the earth. So, like I'm saying, you can either understand the significance that every day, everything we do in our lives has a purpose. Then everything and all the people we do meet, we need to be respectful and to honor those people. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm still working on a hell of a lot of things that, for my own brain health, for my own mental health, all these things I struggle with. But if I can somehow help people understand that being a person who is struggling and you feel like you're all alone, or that you're never going to recover, or like you've reached the bottom, and people say, well, there's no place else but up. No, it's not that. It's we live it every day. If you're living in an Indigenous community, that's First Nations, Inuit, or Métis community, those are Indigenous communities. When you live in those, we're not talking in the city, we're talking on the land. When you live in those communities, every day you see social injustice. Every day. My cousin, who lives in Manitoba, she's talking to me about a 12-year-old who killed herself just this past week. Now, Kevin, his wife has been through chemotherapy for about 5 years. All the cancer is gone, so they're double checking, still keeping on top of her. So many things that happen that are like from the horrific to the miraculous. Everything. So sometimes, like I think, oh, what is the purpose of my podcast, and why do I even do this? Yet when I go to meetings and I hear people who've come into Canada and the struggles they've had to face and the realities of newcomers coming in and how they're adjusting or how they're not adjusting. For example, at the Calgary Stampede, like I said, oil workers used to come in and do R&R, and they have their prostitutes and all this stuff. But today, like you go down the Midway, there are thousands of people. I said there are gangs. The gangs. It doesn't matter. The young people in gangs and just the violence, and they're evolving into that. And you go, well, how? You don't want to control them. You sort of want to, go, why are they so dangerous? Why are people that dangerous? There are Indigenous young people who do not have respect for Indigenous elders. There are young people who just don't care. And they just hate. They just, all this anger. Yet where is that peace? When is that peace going to come to them? I'm at peace. I'm a senior. But how do we help our young people? How do we help them find some peace in a world where there's so many people who want to manipulate, gaslight, and tell their story, have them say, look at me, listen to my story, I'm telling the truth, being pulled left and right. It's I can't even comprehend that. So for whatever reason and however I talk in my podcast, I try to tell the truth about the many talented people that I encounter. I try to talk about the Indigenous people who are doing so much in terms of letting people know what it is to be proud to be Indigenous. And a lot of people, like they've struggled, like they know they've never lived in Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities, but they carry their status cards. And if push comes to shove, they will use that card. But it's used in a way where they're advocating. They're like the one lady who passed away about a month ago. She says, I know I've gotten scholarships because I've shown my Indigenous card. She says, but I'm paying back. I'm paying back all this. She says, because I know I haven't lived on First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities. Like the reality of our young people and the respect they're showing because they're advocating is nothing to poo-poo about. And so for people who are immigrating into Canada and you're looking and talking in front of people who are Indigenous who can pass for white, you've got to understand this. We've been here for thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years. It's only been 500 years. What you see in the Americas right now, all these buildings, these highways and stuff, that's only been 500 years. In Western Canada, it's only been 100 years. In the United States, it's only been 250 years. Like the whole concept that, if time started, say, 2,500 years ago or something, understand just how small and minuscule the timeline is in the Americas. Now, that's just a timeline in the land and what you see being built. All it takes is one asteroid to hit planet Earth, and that's all gone. That's all gone. What more proof do you want? It took what, 7, 8 families, thousands of years ago to populate the entire North and South America. When my parents went to South America, they said, we saw people there that looked just like our neighbors. The genetic, how we are genetically and how we look at each other in terms of Indigenous came from a plan. It didn't come from religion. It came from knowing that we were just, our brothers and sisters were like the deer, the antelope, like everything living. And because of that, we were able to create certain things in our DNA that made us so susceptible to a very unhealthy way of living that the Europeans brought upon the humanity. So we're just in the reality of it. Our young people, some of these young people that are being born don't want to live in this world. Because what's going to happen? Any day somebody could explode those 5 atomic bombs. It's one thing you have science fiction and say, oh, we're going to detect an asteroid, or this man of a jello man called Elon Musk wanting to take a spaceship to Mars or some place. Like, hello, excuse me, let him wiggle like a jello, let him wiggle. If he wants to be hypothetical and use all his money. The reality of it is that grandfathers and grandmothers have a purpose. And every human being in what I know in terms of existence will acknowledge the existence of Creator. They'll acknowledge the existence of the grandmothers and grandfathers. Those things, and that's why I say Creator, grandfathers and grandmothers will be done. No matter how things look in terms of billionaires and the structures that they create and want people to bow down to them as if they're a second coming of a religion or second coming of some sort of purpose they think they're constructing. All it's brought is devastation. So anyway, I'm dragging on. I'm becoming boring. But again, I do miss the conversations I have. There are some people who have touched my heart and will continue to be a part of who I am. And for them, I'm truly and forever grateful. No, I just, in some ways, like just doing this podcast, like I said, when I started my blog 20 years ago, I just put it out into the universe or out on and wrote whatever I could, thinking and hoping someone was listening. So I know because of the spike that I received in my podcast of people listening, that there are people who are actually like paying attention. And I know as time goes on and as things start to unravel in terms of the structure, the changes within my community, I will post those too. Because I have nothing to lose. I have nothing to lose and nothing to gain. But I do believe that this is a part of history and it needs to be documented. So I'm doing it. With that, continue having a good summer. I hope you're staying well and that Mother Nature isn't ravishing on being good to you. But again, that's how we live on this planet. Very frail existence, depending on Creator and grandmothers and grandfathers. With that, have a good day.